March 17, 1931, 2:47 p.m. WGN Radio Studios, Tribune Tower, downtown Chicago. Studio B on the 9th floor. A soundproof room with cork-lined walls, a single microphone suspended from the ceiling, 2 chairs facing each other across a small table. Outside the glass booth, 3 engineers monitored levels. A producer stood with his hand on the emergency cut switch. The red on-air light glowed above the door. 150,000 listeners across Chicago and the surrounding states were tuned in to Chicago Speaks, the afternoon interview program that had become essential listening. Today's guest was the most requested in the show's 3-year history. Al Capone sat in the chair on the left, wearing a gray suit, blue tie, his fedora resting on the table between him and the host. He'd arrived 15 minutes early with his lawyer, who now stood outside the booth watching through the glass. Across from him sat Harold Morrison, 32 years old, veteran reporter for the Tribune, host of Chicago Speaks since its inception. Morrison had interviewed mayors, senators, business magnates, union leaders, but never someone like Capone, never someone the newspapers called public enemy number 1. The show had started at 2:30 p.m. The first 17 minutes had been careful, professional. Morrison asking about Capone's childhood in Brooklyn, his move to Chicago, his early work in the hospitality industry. Capone answering in generalities, pleasant, his voice smooth and controlled. They talked about prohibition, about how the law created opportunities for entrepreneurs willing to meet public demand, about how people wanted to drink despite what the government said. Careful language, nothing incriminating, nothing the federal prosecutors listening could use. But now, 17 minutes in, with the interview settling into a rhythm, Morrison decided to ask the question everyone wanted answered, the question his producer had told him not to ask, the question that could end the interview or make his career. Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Capone, I want to ask you something directly, if I may." "That's what I'm here for," Capone said. His hands rested on the table, relaxed. "The newspapers call you many things, a bootlegger, a racketeer, public enemy number 1. But I want to hear it from you in your own words for our listeners across Chicago." Morrison paused. The pause was deliberate, calculated for radio, building anticipation. "Are you a gangster?" The studio went absolutely still. The engineers stopped adjusting their levels. The producer's hand moved closer to the emergency cut switch. Outside the booth, Capone's lawyer straightened, his face tightening. Capone didn't move, didn't react, just looked at Morrison with those calm, dark eyes. 5 seconds of dead air, an eternity in radio. Then Capone smiled. Not a big smile, just a slight upward turn at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good question, Mr. Morrison," Capone said finally. His voice was still calm, still pleasant. "Mind if I ask you one first?" Morrison hesitated. This wasn't how interviews worked. The host asked questions, the guest answered. But this was Al Capone, and 150,000 people were listening. "Go ahead," Morrison said. "What's a gangster?" Capone asked. Morrison blinked. "I'm sorry?" "What's a gangster?" Capone repeated. "You're asking me if I'm one, so you must have a definition. What is it?" Morrison looked down at his notes. He hadn't prepared for this. "Well, a gangster is someone who engages in illegal activities, organized crime, racketeering." "Illegal according to who?" Capone asked. "According to the law," Morrison said. "The law," Capone repeated. He picked up a glass of water that had been set on the table, took a sip. "The law says a man can't buy a drink in his own country. The law says if a man sells that drink to him, he's a criminal. You think that's a good law, Mr. Morrison?" "Whether it's a good law isn't—" "It's a relevant question," Capone interrupted gently.
Because if the law's bad, then breaking it isn't criminal, it's civic duty. Outside the booth, the producer was gesturing frantically at Morrison. Wrap it up, move on. But Morrison couldn't move on. He was caught now, caught in a conversation that was more interesting than anything he'd prepared. "So you're saying prohibition is unjust?" Morrison asked. "I'm saying the American people voted with their dollars. They want beer. They want whiskey. They want to sit in a restaurant and have a drink with dinner like they did before 1920. Who am I to deny them that?"
"But you profit from it," Morrison said. "So does every restaurant owner in this city," Capone countered. "So does every hotel, every grocery store that sells near beer, every pharmacy that sells medicinal alcohol. The only difference is what they call it. The difference is legality," Morrison insisted. Capone leaned back in his chair. "Is it? Let me ask you something else, Mr. Morrison. You know the Palmer House Hotel? Of course. You know they serve alcohol in their private dining rooms? To aldermen, to judges, to businessmen. Everybody knows it. The police know it. The prosecutors know it. But nobody raids the Palmer House. Nobody arrests those judges. Why is that?" Morrison didn't answer. "I'll tell you why," Capone continued. "Because when rich people break the law, it's called sophistication. When poor people break the same law, it's called crime. That's the real difference, Mr. Morrison. Not what you do, who you are when you do it." The engineers in the booth were watching the levels. Capone's voice was steady, measured, perfect for radio, clear, authoritative, compelling. "So to answer your question," Capone said, "am I a gangster? I'm a businessman. I provide a service people want. I employ people. I pay them well. I take care of their families. I contribute to charities. I help my community." He paused. "If that makes me a gangster, then half of Chicago's business owners are gangsters too. They just have better publicists." Morrison tried to regain control. "But, Mr. Capone, there are allegations of violence associated with your organization. Allegations of intimidation, of allegations," Capone interrupted. "That's an interesting word. It means someone said something without proving it. I could allege that you're a bank robber, Mr. Morrison. Doesn't make it true. There have been investigations that haven't resulted in convictions," Capone said, "because I haven't done anything wrong. I've been arrested, sure. I've been questioned, but I've never been convicted of a serious crime. You know why? Because I'm innocent." The way he said innocent carried weight, not defensive, not protesting, just stating a fact. Morrison shuffled his papers. "Mr. Capone, I have to ask." "Let me ask you something," Capone said, leaning forward now. "You work for the Tribune, right?" "Yes." "The Tribune makes money from advertising, doesn't it?" "Of course. And some of those advertisers, they sell products that compete with other products, sometimes aggressively. Sometimes they spread rumors about their competitors. Sometimes they engage in what you might call cutthroat business practices. Is the Tribune responsible for that?" "That's different." "Is it?" Capone asked. "Or is the Tribune just providing a service like I provide a service, connecting buyers and sellers, facilitating commerce? If somebody uses that service for something questionable, is that the Tribune's fault?" Morrison was losing the interview. He could feel it. Capone had turned the questions around, had made Morrison defend positions he hadn't intended to take. "Mr. Capone, I think what our listeners want to know is—" "What your listeners want to know," Capone said, his voice still calm but carrying more edge now, "is whether I'm the monster the newspapers make me out to be, whether I'm some kind of villain who belongs in a dime novel." He picked up his fedora from the table, turned it slowly in his hands. "I'm not a monster, Mr. Morrison. I'm a man who grew up poor in Brooklyn, who came to Chicago looking for opportunity, who worked hard, who took risks, who succeeded in a business that exists because the government created it with a bad law." "But the violence," Morrison tried again. "What violence?" Capone asked. "Show me where I've been convicted of violence. Show me where I've been convicted of anything except minor tax issues. You can't, because it doesn't exist. Outside the booth, the producer was now frantically signaling. His hand was on the emergency cut switch. The interview was going places it shouldn't go. Mr. Capone, Morrison said, trying one more time to regain control, the federal government has declared you public enemy number one. How do you respond to that designation? And that's when Capone said the thing that made the station cut to commercial. He leaned forward, looked directly at Morrison, and spoke clearly into the microphone so every one of those 150,000 listeners would hear.
Public enemy number one, Capone said slowly, is the government that tells a man what he can drink, where he can drink it, and who he can drink it with. Public enemy number one is the law that creates criminals out of honest businessmen. Public enemy number one is the system that prosecutes me for giving people what they want while protecting the rich people who do the exact same thing behind closed doors. He paused. So if they want to call me public enemy number one, that's fine, but they should look in a mirror first, because the real enemies of the public are the people who wrote Prohibition, and everybody listening right now knows it. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Morrison sat frozen. The engineers stared at their equipment. The producer's hand hovered over the switch. Then the producer hit it. The on-air light went dark. A pre-recorded advertisement for Pepsodent toothpaste started playing. Twice a day, every day, for brighter teeth and fresher breath. Inside the studio, Morrison pulled off his headphones. His hands were shaking slightly. Capone calmly placed his fedora on his head, adjusted it, and stood up. "That was interesting," Capone said pleasantly. "We done?" Yes, we're done," Morrison said. He looked through the glass at his producer, who was already on the phone, probably with the station manager, probably with the lawyers. Capone walked to the door, opened it. His lawyer was waiting. "How'd it go?" the lawyer asked. "Fine," Capone said. "Educational." They walked down the hallway toward the elevator. Behind them, Morrison sat in the empty studio, staring at his notes, replaying the last 20 minutes in his mind. He'd lost control of the interview. He'd let Capone turn it around, had let him use the platform to say things that would make federal prosecutors furious. And the worst part, Capone had made sense. Not legally, not technically, but emotionally, philosophically. He'd made Morrison question things Morrison hadn't intended to question. The elevator arrived. Capone and his lawyer stepped inside. As the doors closed, Capone looked at his reflection in the polished brass. "They'll play parts of it, maybe, edited." "They'll play all of it," Capone said. "Why?" Because 150,000 people heard it live. They can't pretend it didn't happen. If they edit it, people will talk about what was cut. If they play it all, they control the narrative. Capone smiled. "They'll play it all." And he was right. That evening, WGN Radio made a decision. They would rebroadcast the entire interview at 8 p.m., unedited, with a disclaimer at the beginning stating that the views expressed were those of the guest and did not reflect the station's opinions. The disclaimer didn't matter. 300,000 people tuned in to the evening broadcast, double the afternoon audience. The next day, every newspaper in Chicago ran stories about the interview. Capone defends empire on live radio. Public enemy number one calls Prohibition the real enemy. Capone turns the tables on reporter in controversial interview. The Tribune received 847 letters in the following week. 643 of them supported what Capone had said. 204 were outraged. The federal prosecutors opened an investigation into whether the interview constituted some form of witness intimidation or obstruction. It didn't. Capone had been careful. He'd admitted nothing. He'd incriminated no one. He'd simply spoken about prohibition, about business, about the difference between legal and illegal when the law itself was questionable. Harold Morrison never interviewed Capone again, but he kept the notes from that interview in a drawer in his office for the rest of his career. 30 years later, in 1961, A journalism student asked Morrison what the most memorable interview of his career had been. Morrison didn't hesitate. Al Capone, March 17, 1931. We were on air for 20 minutes. I asked him if he was a gangster. He asked me what a gangster was. And for 20 minutes, I couldn't answer. Not in a way that made sense. Not in a way that separated him from half the businessmen in Chicago. The student asked, "Did you think he was a gangster?" Morrison considered the question. "I think he was exactly what he said he was, a businessman who provided a service people wanted. The fact that the service was illegal didn't change that. It just changed what we called him." March 17, 1931. The day Al Capone went on live radio and asked a simple question that nobody could answer. What's a gangster? The station cut to commercial, but the question stayed on the air long after the interview ended.